For many centuries before the rise of the Grand Duchy, the ancestral territories of the Lithuanians existed in a relative historical void, largely unrecorded by the chroniclers of the major Mediterranean and European powers. This geographic isolation, rooted deeply in the expansive marshlands and dense, largely inaccessible forests of the central Baltic region, prevented direct political or military subjugation by the Roman Empire, a fate that fundamentally shaped the history of nearly all other contemporary European peoples. Archaeological evidence from the first millennium of the Common Era indicates that the Baltic tribes maintained a distinct cultural trajectory characterized by specific burial rituals and material culture. The widespread adoption of cremation practices is particularly notable, often involving complex log coffins or stone constructions found in specific, localized clusters, suggesting kin-based territorial control. Linguistic analysis provides the clearest markers of the early communities, identifying the Lithuanians as practitioners of one of the oldest surviving Indo-European language branches. Their dialect preserved archaic elements shed by Germanic, Slavic, and Romance languages, reflecting a prolonged period of minimal external influence. Within this broader Baltic context, the emergence of specific tribal groups that would later coalesce into the core of the state became evident. The Aukštaičiai, or Highlanders, inhabited the central and eastern uplands, developing an agricultural base supplemented by intensive beekeeping and hunting. Their power structure was typically centered around smaller, less centralized hill forts, suggesting a diffusion of political authority among numerous petty princes. In contrast, the Žemaičiai, Samogitians, residing closer to the Baltic Sea and along the western borders, exhibited a different social structure. Their proximity to the coast meant earlier, albeit intermittent, contact with Scandinavian and Western European traders, primarily through the amber trade. However, the Samogitians became renowned for their particularly fierce preservation of traditional customs, most notably their ancestral pagan religion. This cultural resilience proved crucial, as they would later act as an unyielding military buffer against the eastward pressure exerted by the newly established Teutonic and Livonian crusading orders. Just a quick announcement: if you enjoy this video so far, please subscribe to our channel, as it motivates us to bring you a new story every evening. This is the only kind request tonight, and we won't bother you with it anymore until the very end of today's story. Let's get back to the video. The tribal division between the Aukštaičiai and Samogitians, visible in the archaeological record through variations in burial goods and ceramics, established the primary internal geopolitical fault line within the eventual Grand Duchy. By the 11th and 12th centuries, the development of these communities focused increasingly on the construction of sophisticated wooden hill forts pilii. These fortified sites, strategically located on naturally defensible terrain and reinforced by intricate palisades and earthworks, functioned as local economic centers, defensive strongholds, and seats of local chieftain power. The prevalence of these structures indicates a mounting, sustained military pressure, forcing dispersed agricultural groups to centralize their defense and leadership. This internal consolidation of defense, rather than any unifying external ideology, laid the essential foundation for the later emergence of a singular, durable political entity that would be recognized globally. The geopolitical landscape east of the Daugava River underwent profound destabilization during the 11th and 12th centuries, creating a crucible that necessitated the political organization of the fragmented Lithuanian clans. The previously dominant, if often fractious, coherence of the Kyivan Rus shattered into numerous competing principalities. This decentralization transformed the eastern frontier from a relatively stable zone of occasional economic exchange into a volatile region marked by continuous territorial ambition and aggressive military incursions by powerful Ruthenian princes. The chronicles and contemporary documents confirm that principalities like Polotsk, Volhynia, and later Halych Volhynia viewed the adjacent Baltic lands not merely as targets for transient pillaging, but as potential zones for permanent political and ecclesiastical control. Beginning as early as the late 11th century, These campaigns often aimed to extract tribute, secure crucial land routes, and enforce conversions to Orthodox Christianity among the non-Christian Baltic tribes. The Lithuanian clans found themselves simultaneously subjected to these military pressures while learning valuable organizational lessons from their culturally and militarily sophisticated adversaries. This ongoing interaction with the complex feudal and military structures of the collapsing Eastern Slavdom proved instrumental. Success against these better-equipped neighbors could only be achieved through superior coordination and the formation of large organized supra-tribal war bands. Initially, these Lithuanian expeditions were reactive, retaliatory strikes designed to disrupt Ruthenian logistics and recover captured peoples and material wealth. However, a key transition occurred where successful military leaders began directing these forces outward, actively engaging in the internal conflicts of the Ruthenian principalities. This proactive intervention allowed certain powerful kunigai to acquire vast amounts of external resources, which they strategically redistributed to secure the long-term allegiance of their followers, a process fundamental to establishing dynastic authority over disparate groups. Furthermore, the Baltic chiefs realized the strategic advantage of controlling the fortified Ruthenian settlements, particularly those in the region of Black Russes, centered around Novogrudok. The capture and effective governance of these Slavic towns provided the nascent Lithuanian political structure with immediate access to existing administrative frameworks, established tax bases, and a literate bureaucratic class, accelerating their own state-building process by centuries. The continuous external imposition of military and political pressure from the fractured East directly forced the disparate Lithuanian tribal leaders to acknowledge a necessity greater than their local rivalries, driving them toward a tenuous but essential unified command to ensure collective survival. Mindaugas, who emerged in historical records around the 1232, hailed from the eastern Lithuanian uplands of Aukštaitija, where his family had likely consolidated control over several regional domains. Unlike previous ephemeral leaders, Mindaugas possessed the singular ambition and operational ruthlessness necessary to forge a paramount authority. His ascent was characterized by a systematic campaign to eliminate rival kunigai, a process often accomplished through alliances of convenience, followed by sudden and violent political purges. The political landscape was cleared not through open warfare, but through calculated acts of treachery against his own relatives and fellow princes, demonstrating a clear understanding of power consolidation typical of medieval monarchy. The increasing intensity of external pressures, particularly the ongoing aggression from the Teutonic Order, inadvertently served his purpose by making the need for a single, commanding authority undeniable to the surviving nobility. Mindaugas exploited these threats by positioning himself as the indispensable protector of the entire ethno-cultural territory. His domain expanded rapidly into the relatively wealthy and densely populated Ruthenian lands of Black Russes, most notably the key administrative center of Novogrudok. This strategic eastward acquisition provided him with crucial non-Lithuanian military and fiscal resources, including established systems of taxation and a class of experienced Orthodox scribes and administrators. A critical maneuver occurred in the early 1250s, when Mindaugas faced coordinated attacks from internal rivals and external crusading forces. To dismantle this dangerous coalition, he engaged in direct negotiations with the Livonian Order's master, Andreas von Sturland. The resulting agreement was purely pragmatic. Mindaugas consented to accept Catholic baptism in 1251. This diplomatic move instantaneously neutralized the crusading rhetoric of the orders, removing the casus belli that had justified decades of invasion from the west. In return for his conversion and the cession of some marginal Samogitian lands, Mindaugas achieved a political triumph of monumental significance. The papal recognition of his kingship, Pope Innocent IV, sanctioned his coronation, elevating his status from a regional pagan warlord to a legitimate European monarch. This act of legitimation, which occurred around 1253, formally transformed the loose association of war bands and acquired Ruthenian territories into the Kingdom of Lithuania, establishing the first internationally recognized political structure for the Eastern Baltic tribes. Though this initial kingdom was brief and contingent upon continuous political compromise, it set the precedent for monarchical rule and established the core geographic entity of the later Grand Duchy. The decision by Mindaugas to embrace Catholic Christianity in 1251 constituted a decisive act of political engineering, driven less by theological conviction than by immediate existential threat. His newly consolidated but internally volatile political entity faced incessant pressure from the militarized monastic states of the Livonian and Teutonic orders. These crusading organizations operated under papal sanction, wielding the legal doctrine of the casus belli, the right to conquer pagan lands, as an unwavering justification for their territorial expansion into the Baltic region. By strategically initiating negotiations, Mindaugas sought to fundamentally disarm his most formidable ironclad adversaries by invalidating their primary motive for war. The papacy, under Pope Innocent IV, recognized the unique geopolitical opportunity presented by a genuinely powerful, if nominal, convert in the pagan heartland. The Pope's interest lay in expanding the sphere of Western Christendom and installing an ally who could potentially act as a counterweight to the orthodox influence of the Ruthenian principalities in the east. This mutual utility led to the formal papal recognition of the Lithuanian realm. The resultant coronation of Mindaugas as King of Lithuania, which took place around 1253, was a moment of supreme diplomatic significance. The ritual itself, performed with regalia sent from the west, elevated the status of the former Kunigas to a legitimate, sovereign European monarch, establishing his authority within the recognized feudal hierarchy. This shift in legal status provided Lithuania with an indispensable diplomatic shield. Once Mindaugas was crowned a Christian king, the orders could no longer launch major campaigns under the pretext of conversion. Aggression against his realm was technically transformed from a holy crusade into an illicit assault on a fellow Christian kingdom, risking papal censure and political isolation within the Latin world. Mindaugas further solidified this temporary peace by ceding several strategically marginal but symbolic territories to the orders, most notably parts of Samogitian, demonstrating his commitment to the pact. However, the political and spiritual peace proved fragile. The core Lithuanian tribes, particularly the Samogitians, vehemently resisted the cession of their ancestral lands and remained staunchly pagan. Within a few short years, military reversals suffered by the Livonian order at the hands of these unyielding pagan allies emboldened Mindaugas to renounce his Christian oath. Recognizing that the strategic necessity of the papal alliance had expired and his position was secure, he returned to paganism around 1261. This diplomatic betrayal re-established the traditional casus belli, yet by then the foundation for a unified dynastic political power had been permanently set. The fragility of the Lithuanian Catholic kingdom, established in 1253, derived less from external pressure and more from internal political dissonance between the monarch's strategic decisions and the non-negotiable spiritual commitments of the tribal aristocracy. While Mindaugas's baptism secured a temporary, necessary diplomatic ceasefire, it created a profound rift with the powerful, traditional Kunigai, whose military strength was indispensable for maintaining his central authority. This internal resistance was fiercely concentrated among the Samogitian tribes, who remained ideologically committed to the ancestral pagan religion and refused to accept any compromise that legitimized the authority of the Germanic crusading orders. This domestic tension escalated into crisis following decisive military actions taken by these pagan forces. The Samogitians, acting independently under leaders like Alminus and later Mindaugas's nephew Treniota, inflicted catastrophic defeats upon the Livonian order. These victories, particularly at the Battle of Skeuodas in 1259 and the Battle of Derby in 1260, fundamentally altered the regional military balance. The Livonian order was severely crippled, losing hundreds of knights and weakening its administrative and military capacity across the Baltic littoral. These military successes provided undeniable proof to the Lithuanian elite that survival did not necessitate cooperation with Rome, but rather lay in the continued aggressive defense of their ancestral faith and lands. Mindaugas was therefore confronted with a clear political imperative: preserve the title of Christian king and risk continuous internal revolt by his most potent military forces, or renounce the papal crown to consolidate domestic allegiance. He opted for the latter, choosing political pragmatism over his tenuous Christian status. The formal abandonment of the new faith, known as the Great Apostasy around 1261, was a calculated political maneuver to secure the loyalty of the pagan Samogitian and Augustatian warlords, whose military assets were now essential for Lithuania's future territorial expansion and defense. This act immediately secured the internal military cohesion necessary to launch coordinated campaigns against the weakened orders. The repercussions of this renunciation were immediate and total. The nascent Catholic administrative structures were violently dismantled, the few scattered churches were razed, and the tenuous relationship with the papacy and the Holy Roman Empire was summarily terminated. This swift return to ancestral rites re-established the traditional religious identity of the ruling class, but also revived the legal casus belli, re-engaging Lithuania in the existential conflict against the revitalized crusading orders. However, this realignment did not save Mindaugas from domestic politics. His reliance on the ambitious Treniota proved fatal. Within a year of the Great Apostasy, Mindaugas and his two sons were assassinated by a conspiracy led by Treniota and the Prince Domantas of Pskov. This regicide eliminated the first crowned dynasty and plunged the realm into a period of extreme political instability, confirming the complete collapse of the brief Catholic kingdom structure. The establishment of Mindaugas's Catholic kingdom in 1253 proved to be an ephemeral political construct, directly contradicted by the religious identity and military needs of the nascent Grand Duchy. The strategic necessity of his conversion was immediately superseded by the practical need to secure the allegiance of the Samogitian tribes, who were not only staunchly pagan, but also the most effective military counterweight to the encroaching Livonian and Teutonic orders. Mindaugas's cession of traditional Samogitian lands to the orders, as part of his conversion agreement, became a non-negotiable point of contention that undermined his domestic legitimacy. This dissonance came to a head following the Battle of Derb in 1260. In this pivotal engagement, Samogitian forces inflicted a catastrophic defeat on the combined Crusader armies, shattering the immediate military threat posed by the Livonian order. This decisive pagan victory provided Mindaugas with the political cover he required to sever his ties with the papacy. The battle's outcome demonstrated that the military strength necessary for Lithuania's survival resided not in diplomatic compromise with Rome, but in the sustained aggressive capacity of the traditional pagan military elite. Mindaugas, recognizing this political reality, formally renounced his Catholic baptism around 1261, signaling the Great Apostasy. This betrayal of the new faith was a purely calculated maneuver to consolidate the loyalty of the powerful Samogitian warlords and re-establish internal military cohesion. By returning to the ancestral pagan religion, he restored his relationship with the traditional Lithuanian nobility, who viewed the preservation of the ancient rites as inseparable from national sovereignty. The ephemeral Catholic kingdom immediately collapsed, invalidating the papal bulls that recognized him as king and re-establishing the casus belli for the military orders. However, this strategic reversal did not secure his personal dynasty. By reinstating militant paganism, Mindaugas inadvertently empowered the ruthless elements of his own family, led by his nephew Treniota. Treniota, a zealous pagan and military leader, viewed Mindaugas's brief Christian interlude as a weakness and a betrayal of the core principles that underpinned Lithuanian power. This ideological clash, combined with Treniota's own ambition, culminated in the assassination of Mindaugas and his two sons in 1263. This act of regicide terminated the first Lithuanian royal house and plunged the realm into a succession crisis, confirming that for the time being, power in the Grand Duchy would be determined by military force and pagan loyalty rather than religious sanction or dynastic right. The period following the protracted succession crises of the late 13th century necessitated the emergence of a ruler capable of transforming sporadic tribal defense into a coherent, centralized military strategy. Vytenis, whose rise around 1295 marks the beginning of the stable Gediminid dynasty, inherited a realm defined entirely by relentless conflict with the Teutonic and Livonian orders. This sustained confrontation became an institutional reality, defining the state's foreign policy and military structure for 2 centuries. Vytenis's primary contribution was establishing an iron wall, a continuous, formalized system of defense designed to impose overwhelming attrition upon the invaders. The core of this defense rested on the strategic network of fortified wooden castles, known as pillars. These structures were not isolated strongholds. Rather, they were interconnected garrisons concentrated along the vulnerable border regions of Samogitia and Aukštaitija. Castles such as Kaunas and Trakai served as both crucial administrative centers and critical choke points, compelling Crusader armies to divert resources into lengthy, costly siege operations. By forcing the orders to engage in siege warfare, Vytenis countered their natural advantage in mounted, heavy cavalry field battles. Vytenis further refined the use of deep forest ambushes and guerrilla tactics, leveraging the Grand Duchy's dense, impassable terrain as a defensive asset. Lithuanian forces avoided decisive, large-scale confrontations unless conditions were overwhelmingly favorable. Instead, they focused on targeted, punitive counter-raids deep into the territories of the Order, aiming to degrade their supply lines, destroy settlements, and drain their manpower reserves. The psychological and material objective was not conquest, but attrition to bleed the Teutonic armies year after year, making the cost of occupation and even mere invasion politically and economically unsustainable for the Crusaders. This era witnessed the systematization of the Lithuanian military organization. Vytenis began integrating the military capacities of the newly secured Ruthenian principalities in the east, incorporating Orthodox auxiliaries and their distinct fighting traditions into the pagan Lithuanian core forces. This created a larger, more resilient army capable of fighting simultaneously on 2 fronts, defending against the Catholic Crusaders in the west, while expanding against vulnerable Ruthenian lands in the east. This necessary duality of military focus ensured that the Grand Duchy was simultaneously defensive and expansionist. Vytenis secured key alliances with foreign powers, notably establishing military cooperation with the city of Riga to offset the power of the Livonian Order, demonstrating a sophisticated diplomatic understanding of the regional balance of power. His reign thus transformed the Lithuanian realm from a loose confederation into a cohesive military state, fundamentally prepared for the protracted, existence-defining conflict that characterized the Lithuanian Crusades. The rule of Gediminas, commencing around 1316, fundamentally redefined the purpose and structure of the Grand Duchy, shifting its strategic posture from mere survival to aggressive, systematic territorial expansion. Gediminas successfully ended the era of chaotic succession disputes, cementing the power of the Gediminid dynasty and establishing the stable political framework necessary for long-term state building. His reign marked the transformation of the Lithuanian realm from a loose military confederation into a cohesive great power of Eastern Europe. His primary focus lay not in the west, where Vytenis had established the iron defense against the Crusader orders, but in the east, where the fragmented, vulnerable principalities of the former Kyivan Rus offered vast geopolitical opportunities. Gediminas effectively adopted a 3-pronged strategy to incorporate these immense Ruthenian lands. First, military conquest secured the strategic principalities bordering the core Lithuanian lands, integrating territories such as Polotsk and Minsk. These campaigns were characterized by superior military organization and the systematic use of sieges and field battles to overcome localized resistance. Second, Gediminas masterfully employed diplomacy and strategic marriage alliances to secure control over territories without costly campaigns. By marrying his numerous children into the orthodox ruling families of the eastern principalities, he established peaceful dynastic claims over key regions like Volhynia and Tver. This integration utilized political absorption rather than destruction, allowing the local Orthodox elites to maintain their status, legal codes, and Orthodox faith, provided they acknowledged the paramount authority of the pagan Grand Duke in Vilnius. This pragmatic approach effectively doubled the Grand Duchy's size, creating a state where the majority of the population was Orthodox and Slavonic. Third, Gediminas pioneered the use of the written word in international relations. Recognizing the geopolitical value of European diplomacy, he issued letters to Western cities and the papacy, inviting merchants, artisans, and clerical orders into Lithuania. These letters, written in Latin and German, aimed to secure favorable economic treaties, attract foreign specialists necessary for urban development, and subtly manipulate the papacy into mediating the relentless crusader aggression. Gediminas strategically positioned himself as a potential future Christian ruler, a diplomatic ploy designed to undermine the casus belli of the Teutonic Order, while simultaneously modernizing his realm. This era established Vilnius as the permanent capital and major political center, consolidating the administrative functions necessary to govern an expansive, multi-ethnic, and multi-confessional state. The founding of Vilnius in the early 14th century was not a spontaneous event, but a decisive strategic move by Gediminas to establish a permanent, secure capital for the rapidly expanding Grand Duchy. Until this period, the realm had operated largely from politically sensitive and militarily vulnerable locations, such as the island fortress of Trakai. Gediminas recognized that governing an expansive, multi-ethnic state required a new, central administrative and symbolic hub. The chosen location, at the confluence of the Neris and Vilneli rivers, offered profound geopolitical advantages. Militarily, the natural topography comprising defensive hills and waterways provided protection far superior to the exposed western frontiers perpetually under siege by the crusading orders. This inland position was intentionally chosen to be distant from the continuous chaos of the Lithuanian Crusades, securing the political heartland from swift invasion, and allowing the Grand Duke to focus resources on eastern expansion rather than border defense. The official establishment of Vilnius as the capital is historically situated around 1323, coinciding with the initial wave of Gediminas's diplomatic letters to the west. These letters, which solicited foreign settlement, also explicitly designated Vilnius, as the royal city. This proclamation was crucial, as it instantly elevated the settlement's status on the European diplomatic map, signifying its role as a permanent center of government and commerce. Gediminas immediately commenced the construction of Vilnius's defensive system, including the upper and lower castles, utilizing materials and techniques superior to the older wooden fortresses. The rapid construction efforts consolidated the administrative and military functions of the Grand Duchy within a single complex. Furthermore, Vilnius became the primary pagan religious center of the Grand Duchy, housing the most important shrines and the high priest, or krivis. This religious centralization was an essential counterpart to the political capital, anchoring the ancestral rites and the power of the ruling Gediminid dynasty in a specific, sacrosanct location. This move helped standardize and reinforce the pagan identity of the Lithuanian core, which was essential given that the vast majority of the newly incorporated population in the east was Orthodox Christian. Vilnius therefore functioned as the definitive boundary between the pagan-ruled core and the Orthodox-governed periphery. The city quickly evolved into a multi-confessional and multicultural hub, accommodating the needs of incoming German merchants and artisans attracted by Gediminas's promises of tax and trade privileges alongside the established Slavic and Lithuanian populations. This strategic foundation ensured the capital was resilient, economically dynamic, and institutionally prepared to govern a burgeoning Eastern European empire. The establishment of Vilnius as the administrative centre gave Gediminas the necessary security to execute his most innovative and daring strategy, a direct diplomatic offensive targeting the highest authorities in Western Europe. This move, launched primarily through a series of letters between 1323 and 1324, represented a fundamental shift from reliance on purely military solutions to leveraging the complex political and religious anxieties of the continent. Gediminas's astonishing diplomatic achievement was to simultaneously challenge the Teutonic Order's legitimacy while positioning the Grand Duchy as a potential partner for European modernization. The letters were addressed to diverse entities: Pope John XXII in Avignon, prominent monastic orders, and the burgeoning commercial leagues, most importantly the Hanseatic merchants in Lübeck, Rostock, and Stralsund. This targeted communication utilized the divisions between the papacy and the crusading orders. Gediminas argued that the Teutonic Knights were not engaged in genuine evangelization, but in rapacious conquest, claiming their actions actively obstructed his own desire to bring the Lithuanian people into the Catholic fold. This forced the papacy into the awkward position of having to question the spiritual mission of its own military arm in the Baltic. The contents of the letters were highly pragmatic. Gediminas extended an open invitation to Catholic settlers, artisans, farmers, and even monks and clergy. He offered unprecedented incentives, including generous tax exemptions, freedom of worship, and protection under Lithuanian law. This was not merely an act of goodwill. It was an urgent attempt to import the skills and demographic assets necessary for economic and urban modernization. The influx of specialized craftsmen and merchants, particularly Germans, was crucial for developing the monetary economy, building stone fortifications superior to wood, and establishing trade links beyond the localized conflicts of the Baltic frontier. Crucially, Gediminas dictated the terms of this engagement entirely on his own timetable. He presented the conversion of the Grand Duchy not as an unconditional surrender to papal demands, but as a deliberate political choice to be implemented gradually, ensuring it did not provoke an irreversible revolt from the powerful, pagan Lithuanian nobility. By allowing Catholic settlers to practice their faith openly while maintaining his personal pagan status, he sought to create a state defined by religious pragmatism, where different confessions contributed to the unified political entity. Though the promised mass conversion never fully materialized during his lifetime, this diplomatic offensive successfully created a sustained, diplomatic international defense mechanism that provided critical breathing room for the young, expansive state. Gediminas's territorial strategy, concurrent with his diplomatic appeals to the West, executed a decisive pivot toward the vulnerable principalities of the fragmented Kyivan Rus inheritance. This march eastward was not characterized by a single, destructive invasion, but by a systematic, generations-long policy of strategic incorporation, a process that expanded the Grand Duchy's geographic and demographic scope exponentially. The primary targets were the lands stretching along the western Dvina and Dnieper river systems, which commanded crucial overland trade routes and bordered the core Lithuanian homeland. The acquisition of key city-states like Polotsk, Vitebsk, and Minsk was paramount to establishing this new geopolitical reality. Polotsk, a powerful commercial center along the western Dvina, was absorbed through a negotiated agreement. Recognizing the mutual threat posed by the expanding Teutonic Order, Polotsk's elites opted for alliance with the strong, stable pagan power of Vilnius, rather than risk conquest or absorption by other splinter states. This process established a model of vassalage that preserved the local Orthodox administration, legal system, and currency. Vitebsk's incorporation was secured through a classic dynastic maneuver. The marriage of Gediminas's son Algirdas to the last ruling princess of Vitebsk, Maria of Vitebsk, around 1318, provided a legitimate, peaceful claim to the Principality upon the death of her father. This established the essential precedent of the Gediminid family integrating directly into the Ruthenian aristocracy, legitimizing their rule through traditional Orthodox succession rights. Minsk and other southern principalities were consolidated through a combination of military pressure and the strategic positioning of loyal Lithuanian princes, kunigai, as governors, ensuring their continued obedience to Vilnius. The cumulative effect of this expansion was the immediate transformation of the Grand Duchy into a multi-ethnic state. By the mid-14th century, the realm stretched from the Baltic Sea deep into the Dnieper basin, incorporating immense territories where the population was overwhelmingly Ruthenian ancestors of modern Belarusians and Ukrainians, and adhered to Orthodox Christianity. The ruling political paradox was now fixed. A small, militarily potent Lithuanian pagan elite governed a vast agrarian Orthodox Christian majority. This required profound administrative pragmatism. Rather than imposing Lithuanian language or pagan rites, the Grand Duchy adopted Old Ruthenian, a Slavic language, as the official language of chancery, administration, and law. The pre-existing legal codes, based on the Ruskaya Pravda, were retained, guaranteeing the continuity and stability desired by the local boyar and urban classes. This soft, adaptive governance was the primary factor that differentiated Lithuanian rule from the harsh, destructive policies often associated with the Mongol successor states, securing the loyalty of the newly acquired populations. The unique political structure that emerged following the death of Gediminas did not adhere to the typical pattern of monarchical succession, but rather evolved into a highly effective system of diarchy, or dual rule, maintained by two of his sons, Algirdas and Kęstutis. This unconventional arrangement, centered around the sharing of paramount authority, became the cornerstone of the Grand Duchy's defense and expansion for nearly 3 decades. See 1345–1377. The stability of the realm was built upon this principle of complementary function rather than competing power. Algirdas, established in Vilnius, held the title of Grand Duke and was the senior partner, primarily directing the state's political and military initiatives across the vast, unstable eastern frontier. His strategic focus was the incorporation of the fragmented former principalities of Kyivan Rus and the management of the immense Orthodox population. Algirdas successfully maintained the established policy of administrative pragmatism, avoiding religious imposition, while skillfully exploiting the weakness of the Golden Horde and the ambitions of the growing Muscovite principality. His campaigns extended Lithuanian influence deep into the Dnieper basin, securing major acquisitions like Kyiv and establishing firm control over Podolia. This methodical expansion was executed not through defensive fortifications, but through aggressive, mobile military action, solidifying the Grand Duchy's status as the largest state in Europe by area. Conversely, Kęstutis, ruling from his strongholds at Trakai and Kaunas, shouldered the constant and desperate burden of defending the western frontier. His singular and unyielding focus was the military and logistical defense against the fanatical, highly organized aggression of the Teutonic and Livonian orders. Kęstutis's leadership was defined by relentless warfare, characterized by frequent border skirmishes, retaliatory incursions into Prussia and Livonia, and the construction of fortified castle networks. He mastered the strategic necessity of deep forest ambushes and rapid counter-raids, designed not for territorial gain, but for the attrition of manpower and resources of the crusading orders. The functional effectiveness of the diarchy lay in the strict definition of their geographical and operational spheres. Algirdas provided the territorial depth and manpower necessary for survival, while Kęstutis provided the essential security and diplomatic stability in the West. They operated in lockstep. No major military action, treaty negotiation, or succession decision was conducted without the approval and cooperation of the other, a remarkable achievement given the violent history of the Gediminid family. This joint system ensured that the Grand Duchy could simultaneously pursue diametrically opposed geopolitical goals, eastward expansion and westward defense, without fracturing its central authority. The culmination of Algirdas's eastern geopolitical strategy involved a direct, calculated challenge to the declining sovereignty of the Golden Horde. Unlike his father's earlier policy, which capitalized primarily on the weakness of fragmented Ruthenian principalities, Algirdas sought to displace the Mongol successor state from its position as the supreme political arbiter of the Eastern European steppe. The Grand Duchy's prior territorial gains, which included the integration of Smolensk and Volhynia, had already brought the Lithuanian sphere of influence into direct contact with the Mongol vassal territories along the lower Dnieper. This proximity made confrontation inevitable. The decisive military action occurred circa 1362 at the Battle of Blue Waters, Sini Vodai. Algirdas led a consolidated Lithuanian-Ruthenian force against three Mongol princelings of the Golden Horde, Kutlug Bey, Kasi Bey, and Dmitri. The engagement took place near the mouth of the Sini Vodai River, likely a tributary of the Southern Bug. The key to the Lithuanian victory lay in Algirdas's superior maneuverability and the tactical deployment of his archers and light cavalry, effectively neutralizing the traditional massed shock tactics of the Mongol cavalry. The disciplined execution of this strategy resulted in the complete rout of the Mongol forces and the death of the three Tumen commanders. The immediate geopolitical outcome of the Battle of Blue Waters was the dramatic extension of the Grand Duchy's southern and eastern boundaries. With the Mongol military presence effectively destroyed in the region, Lithuanian authority swiftly filled the resultant power vacuum. The Grand Duchy secured control over the vast, fertile steppelands of Podolia and extended its influence towards the Black Sea littoral. This conquest was critical because it pushed the realm's southern border to an international sea, opening up potential new commercial pathways and altering the geopolitical axis of the entire state. The most significant strategic acquisition was the firm establishment of control over the Principality of Kyiv. Although Kyiv had previously acknowledged Lithuanian suzerainty under Gediminas, the victory at Blue Waters definitively confirmed the city's subordination to Vilnius, liberating it from Mongol tribute payment and direct interference. This established the Grand Duchy as the sole inheritor and protector of the core cultural and religious centers of the former Rus. By the close of Algirdas's reign in 1377, these strategic victories against the Horde had finalized the Grand Duchy's transformation. The realm officially encompassed nearly all the western and central territories of the old Rus estate, creating a monolithic territorial entity spanning approximately 930,000 square kilometers. This final stage of expansion successfully integrated the entirety of the Dnieper River system and pushed the frontier to the Black Sea, making the Grand Duchy of Lithuania demonstrably the largest single political state in all of Europe during the late 14th century. The strategic culmination of the Grand Duchy's eastern policy centered on neutralizing the remaining effective power of the Golden Horde within the Dnieper region. The primary obstacle to firm territorial sovereignty remained the Mongol administration's direct control over the southern principalities and the resulting extraction of tribute. To establish definitive sovereignty, military conflict was required to displace the Horde's appointed authority. The decisive engagement took place near the river Sini Vodai, Blue Waters, a location traditionally identified near the southern Bug River. The Lithuanian-Ruthenian forces, commanded by Grand Duke Algirdas, confronted the Mongol field army of the Horde, which was organized under the authority of three regional Tumen commanders, Kutlug Bey, Kasi Bey, and Dmitri. The year 1362 marks this historically pivotal confrontation. The Mongol power structure had been significantly weakened by internal conflicts and succession struggles following the death of Jani Beg, allowing Algirdas to exploit a period of critical instability. Algirdas avoided a direct frontal engagement, recognizing the residual strength of the Mongol heavy cavalry. Instead, he employed a superior tactical configuration that leveraged the combined mobility of his Lithuanian light cavalry and the discipline of his Ruthenian infantry contingents. The forces were deployed in a crescent formation, designed to both receive the Mongol charge and execute simultaneous flanking maneuvers. The battle was won through methodical attrition and encirclement, utilizing missile fire and disciplined withdrawals to break the cohesive charge of the Mongol cavalry. The resulting rout of the Mongol forces was total, confirmed by the confirmed deaths of the 3 Teuton commanders, shattering the Golden Horde's organized military capacity north of the Crimean steppe. The immediate geopolitical impact of the Blue Waters victory was the rapid establishment of Lithuanian governance over extensive territories previously subject to the Horde. This action directly incorporated the historically significant region of Podolia, which was promptly settled and administered by Lithuanian kunigai and Ruthenian nobles loyal to Vilnius. Critically, the victory established undisputed Lithuanian control over the Principality of Kyiv, ending centuries of Mongol suzerainty and integrating the spiritual and cultural core of the former Rus state into the Grand Duchy's domains. Furthermore, the victory significantly expanded the Grand Duchy's southern frontier to the line of the Dniester River, securing access to vital riverine commercial routes and pushing the realm's boundary within striking distance of the Black Sea littoral. This move successfully eliminated the most significant political competitor to the Grand Duchy in Eastern Europe, formally concluding the Mongol dominance in the region. The security gained on the southern flank allowed Algirdas to dedicate greater resources to the emerging competition with Muscovy in the northeast. The strategic defense of the Grand Duchy during the joint reign fell almost entirely upon Kęstutis, who was responsible for maintaining the integrity of the western frontier against the Teutonic Order. This commitment necessitated a perpetual attritional conflict known in the monastic chronicles as the Guerra Totalis, a constant state of armed defense that defined the political and economic structure of the Lithuanian heartland for over 4 decades. Unlike Algirdas's campaigns of eastward expansion, Kęstutis's mandate was one of pure, unyielding survival. The core of the Order's strategy involved meticulously planned, annual invasions or raises aimed at 2 primary objectives: breaking the military strength of the Samogitian tribes and capturing the key fortified pagan centers of the Lithuanian core. The defense centered on a sophisticated, multi-layered system of wooden and stone fortifications. Castles like those at Kaunas, Trakai, and Medininkai were not merely static defenses, but served as logistical hubs for staging counter-raids and housing garrisons. Their construction and maintenance required immense, non-stop mobilization of labor and resources, fundamentally shaping the pre-Christian state economy. Kęstutis's tactical genius lay in avoiding decisive, pitched battles that favored the Order's heavily armored cavalry and crossbow-armed infantry. Instead, he relied on devastating deep forest ambushes, utilizing the challenging terrain to neutralize the logistical and technological advantages of the crusading armies. Lithuanian forces, composed primarily of mobile light cavalry and infantry skilled in irregular warfare, executed preemptive strikes and rapid counterattacks, often targeting the Order's extended supply lines and vulnerable retinues of European guest crusaders. This harassment was strategically designed to elevate the immense human cost of the raises, eroding the political will of the European aristocracy funding the campaigns. The Teutonic Knights, in response, became masters of siege warfare, repeatedly assaulting the most crucial defensive strongholds. The intensity of this conflict exacted a crippling economic toll on the heartland territories of Samogitia and Aukštaitija. Agricultural production was routinely interrupted by burnings, cattle confiscation, and the conscription of men for constant military service and fortification repair. The demographic strain was significant, requiring a constant influx of resources and prisoners of war from the eastern territories to sustain the war effort in the west. Kęstutis, therefore, was not merely a military commander, but a highly pragmatic statesman. His famous, repeated periods of captivity by the Order were often intentional diplomatic maneuvers, utilizing his own freedom as a bargaining chip to secure temporary truces or intelligence. His governance was a singular, focused enterprise, channeling the wealth and manpower gained by Algirdas's eastern conquests directly into the western defense, creating an economic subsidy that enabled the stubborn preservation of the pagan Grand Duchy against the aggressive zeal of the most powerful military-religious organization in Europe. The death of Grand Duke Algirdas in 1377 immediately terminated the foundational political structure of the Grand Duchy, the stable, long-standing system of dual governance maintained with his brother Kęstutis. Algirdas, the architect of eastward expansion, died having designated his son Jagiello as the sole successor to the Grand Ducal throne in Vilnius. This decision, which prioritized the continuation of the Gediminid line over the established equilibrium of shared power, created an instant and profound constitutional crisis. The decades of effective collaboration between Algirdas, focusing on the Eastern Front, and Kęstutis, managing the vital Western defense against the Teutonic Order, were summarily placed under immediate threat. Kęstutis, who had loyally served as de facto co-ruler and military governor of the core Lithuanian territories from his base at Trakai, legitimately viewed this unilateral succession as a betrayal of their political arrangement. The designated successor, Jagiello, lacked the military experience and political depth necessary to command the obedience of the sprawling, multi-ethnic state, especially the powerful and fiercely independent Ruthenian principalities incorporated by his father. Kęstutis, by contrast, commanded the unwavering allegiance of the traditional Lithuanian military elite and was the undeniable authority on the relentless Teutonic frontier. The internal strife rapidly escalated from a political dispute into open civil war by 1381. Jagiello, seeking to consolidate his tenuous position, initiated secret diplomatic negotiations with the existential enemy of the state, the Teutonic Order. In September 1380, he signed the secret Treaty of Dovidishkus with the Order's Grand Master, Winrich von Kniprode. This agreement was a calculated geopolitical maneuver. Jagiello promised non-interference if the Order attacked Kęstutis's domains, effectively leveraging the Teutonic military machine to eliminate his primary domestic rival. Kęstutis exposed and counteracted this conspiracy with decisive military action. He quickly marched on Vilnius, captured Jagiello, and briefly assumed the title of Grand Duke, restoring the traditional power balance. However, the subsequent peace proved fragile. Jagiello, feigning submission, was allowed to retain his patrimonial lands. He used this opportunity to organize a powerful counter-coup, once again seeking the military backing of the Teutonic Order, a relationship that had become critical to his strategy. In 1382, Jagiello and his forces recaptured Vilnius and Trakai, seizing control of the state. The final confrontation occurred when Kęstutis, accompanied by his son Vytautas, arrived to negotiate with Jagiello near the castle of Kyivan. Jagiello, secured by his alliance with the knights, seized both men. Within days, Kęstutis was found dead in the Kyivan dungeon under suspicious circumstances, officially reported as suicide. This elimination of the most powerful and popular military leader secured Jagiello's sole rule, but, at the cost of igniting continued internal conflict with Kęstutis's son, Vytautas, and irrevocably fracturing the previously stable political foundation of the Grand Duchy. The political instability following the assassination of Kęstutis left Jagiello, the new sole Grand Duke, facing a profound and multidimensional crisis that threatened the very existence of the Grand Duchy. Internally, he faced relentless opposition from his cousin Vytautas, who had escaped captivity and was now allied with the Teutonic Order. Externally, the Teutonic Knights remained a perpetual existential military threat, while the increasingly powerful Grand Principality of Muscovy actively contested Lithuanian hegemony over the eastern Ruthenian lands. To survive, Jagiello required immediate and overwhelming resources that surpassed the Grand Duchy's domestic capacity. The strategic solution emerged in 1385 with the formal negotiation of the Union of Kyivan, a groundbreaking dynastic and political agreement with the Kingdom of Poland. The Polish aristocracy, having endured a period of interregnum following the death of King Louis of Hungary, sought a powerful, permanent monarch for their young queen, Jadwiga, and a decisive military ally against the Teutonic aggression along their northern border. Jagiello presented an ideal candidate, commanding the military strength of the largest state in Europe at the time. The Act of Kyivan, signed in 1385, was a legal document that formalized this pivotal geopolitical transaction. Its core provisions were explicit and transformative. Jagiello, the reigning pagan ruler, agreed to be baptized into the Catholic faith, along with his entire court and any remaining pagan subjects of the Grand Duchy. This conversion permanently ended the era of pagan statehood in Lithuania. In return, Jagiello was granted the hand of the 11-year-old Queen Jadwiga and was subsequently crowned King of Poland, Jure Uxorus, initiating a personal union between the two states. Crucially, the document contained a clause regarding the Grand Duchy the promise to applicare or permanently join his Lithuanian lands to the Polish crown. While Polish interpretation saw this as a definitive incorporation of Lithuania into Poland, Jagiello's subsequent actions and later negotiations established a legal interpretation of a personal union, meaning the two states would share a monarch while retaining separate legal, administrative, and governmental structures. This initial ambiguity would become the basis for subsequent internal conflicts between Poland and the Lithuanian elite. The immediate consequences of the union were threefold. First, it achieved the official Christianization of Lithuania in 1387, providing the legal and theological foundation for neutralizing the Teutonic Order's primary justification for aggression, the casus belli based on paganism. Second, it created a unified, massive military demographic power bloc, consolidating the combined resources of both states against external threats. Third, and most importantly for Jagiello, it provided the royal legitimacy and military backing necessary to finally marginalize his cousin and rival, Vytautas, and secure the continuity of the Gediminid dynasty across two crowns. This act permanently repositioned the Grand Duchy within the Western European cultural and political sphere. The official baptism of Lithuania in 1387 marked the singular, most profound shift in the Grand Duchy's geopolitical and cultural identity, formally ending its status as the last remaining pagan state in Europe. This mass conversion was not a gradual missionary effort, but a swift, top-down executive command mandated by the Act of Kryło, executed by King Jagiello upon his accession to the Polish throne. The primary political goal of this action was the permanent removal of the Teutonic Order's foundational pretext for the casus belli, the holy war against the infidels, thereby eliminating the existential threat to the Lithuanian core territories. Jagiello returned to Vilnius specifically to oversee the ceremonial and administrative implementation of the decree. The initial conversion efforts focused exclusively on the ethnic Lithuanian nobility and the core pagan populace of Aukštaitija. This strategic prioritization aimed to cement the Catholic faith among the ruling elite, distinguishing them from the vast, largely Orthodox Ruthenian majority already incorporated into the Grand Duchy's domains. The Grand Duke participated personally in mass baptism ceremonies and traditional pagan sacred sites, including permanent fires and groves, were destroyed or designated for the construction of the first Catholic churches. Crucially, the conversion was immediately translated into a legal and social restructuring of the Lithuanian state. In the Privilege of 1387, Jagiello granted the newly baptized Catholic nobility legal parity with the Polish Szlachta nobility. This act was revolutionary, elevating the political and economic rights of Catholic Lithuanian lords, granting them hereditary rights over land and exempting them from certain taxes and duties. This legally reinforced class distinction solidified the social position of the Catholic elite over their pagan and Orthodox counterparts, creating a deeply entrenched religious and political hierarchy within the multi-confessional state. The administrative transformation was also immediate. Jagiello established the bishopric of Vilnius in 1387, subordinating it directly to the Archdiocese of Gniezno in Poland, thus integrating the Lithuanian ecclesiastical structure into the Polish one. This move formalized the Catholic Church's presence and gave the Polish hierarchy influence over Lithuanian spiritual affairs. The construction of the Vilnius Cathedral, dedicated to Saints Stanislaus and Ladislaus, at the site of the former pagan sanctuary, symbolized the definitive displacement of the ancestral faith at the center of the Grand Duchy's power. However, the conversion process was complex and shallow in many areas. While the Lithuanian nobility quickly accepted the faith for the accompanying legal and political privileges, the traditional Samogitian tribes proved intensely resistant to external religious imposition. Furthermore, the commitment focused on Catholicism exclusively, consciously omitting the rights of the Orthodox majority and setting the stage for subsequent political and religious tension between the Ruthenian Orthodox magnates and the newly empowered Catholic Lithuanian aristocracy. The baptism was thus a legal, political, and strategic masterstroke that fundamentally repositioned the Grand Duchy as a major Catholic power, yet simultaneously introduced new, deep-seated internal religious fractures. The official Christianization of Lithuania in 1387, while strategically eliminating the Teutonic Order's casus belli against the central Grand Duchy, failed to pacify the western territories of Samogitia. This region, situated critically between the Livonian and Prussian branches of the Teutonic Orders, remained intensely pagan and became the geopolitical flashpoint of the subsequent decades. The Samogitian tribes viewed Jagiello's Catholic imposition not as an act of political necessity, but as a treacherous betrayal of the ancestral faith, directly aligning the Grand Duke with the foreign crusading aggression. This region's defiance stemmed from a deep-rooted, structural opposition to external authority. The Samogitians, protected by their dense geography and fiercely independent local kunagai, had historically maintained autonomy even from the central Lithuanian rulers. Their commitment to the pagan tradition was uncompromising. Consequently, the newly established bishopric of Vilnius held no effective jurisdiction in Samogitia. The religious transformation was a legal fiction that did not penetrate the local social or spiritual fabric. This resistance provided the Teutonic Order with the perfect loophole to continue its military operations. The order argued before the papacy and the Holy Roman Empire that the conversion of Jagiello and Aukštaitija was incomplete, fraudulent, and irrelevant, so long as the Samogitians, nominally subjects of the Grand Duchy, remained dedicated to their idolatry. This pretext allowed the knights to maintain their decades-long policy of relentless invasion, particularly targeting the strategically vital Samogitian lowlands. For the order, Samogitia was the crucial geographical link that would allow them to unite their separate territories and consolidate total control over the Baltic coast. The continuous military conflict was formalized in a series of treaties that demonstrated Samogitia's role as a disposable political pawn. Under the Treaty of Salinus, 1398, Vytautas, seeking peace in the west to pursue ambitions in the east, ceded the territory of Samogitia to the Teutonic Knights. This cession, undertaken without the consent of the local population, triggered an immediate and furious armed revolt by the Samogitian leadership against the combined forces of Vytautas and the Order. The Samogitians forced a military stalemate, demonstrating that legal decree held little weight against armed popular resistance. The region remained a perpetual theatre of war, forcing Vytautas to repeatedly cede or reclaim the territory in subsequent treaties, including the Treaty of Racionj, 1404. Each concession was followed by a fresh Samogitian rebellion, invariably supported by secret Lithuanian provisions. This prolonged defiance meant the Teutonic Knights never achieved sustained control over the territory. The Samogitian resistance, therefore, served the vital geopolitical function of preventing the unification of the Order's territories, thereby preserving the territorial integrity of the Grand Duchy's core and ultimately forcing a final military reckoning with the crusading state. The trajectory of Vytautas, son of Algirdas, was initially defined by profound political treachery and calculated desperation, driven by the need to secure his patrimonial authority within the fragmented Grand Duchy. Following the death of his father and the subsequent power vacuum, his involvement in the 1381 civil war with his cousin Jagiello, the designated Grand Duke, proved immediately catastrophic. Vytautas was captured alongside his father Kęstutis during a negotiation that masked Jagiello's strategic deception. While Kęstutis perished under suspicious circumstances in Kradyva Castle, Vytautas engineered a pivotal escape in 1382, famously utilizing the garments of his wife's maid. This act was not a retreat, but the prelude to an extraordinary political gamble. Exiled and stripped of all hereditary domains, Vytautas immediately initiated an alliance with the Grand Duchy's existential enemy, the Teutonic Order. This first betrayal of the Lithuanian state was formalized through the Treaty of Dubysa in 1382. Under its terms, Vytautas formally acknowledged the Grand Master as his feudal superior and ceded the fiercely pagan region of Samogitia up to the Dubysa River, a price he was willing to pay for the order's military leverage. Utilizing Teutonic Knights and resources, he launched destructive campaigns against Jagiello's core territories in a relentless effort to enforce his claim to the domains of Trakai and Grodno. However, the instability of this foreign alliance soon became apparent, as the order was interested only in permanent territorial gains, not Vytautas's personal ambitions. This realization, coupled with Jagiello's own pragmatic need to stabilize the duchy, prompted a fragile reconciliation. In 1384, Vytautas defected from the order, burned several of their captured castles, and returned to the GDL, accepting Grodno and Podlasie as his granted territory. This détente proved short-lived. Following Jagiello's ascension to the Polish throne via the Union of Kriwo in 1385, Jagiello placed his brother, Skirgala, in charge of the crucial Vilnius and Trakai principalities. This deliberate marginalization reignited Vytautas's fury and his determination to seize paramount power. The resulting renewed civil conflict was defined by a second, equally audacious flight and alliance with the Teutonic Order in 1389. Vytautas, having failed to capture Vilnius, once again offered territorial concessions, specifically confirming the cession of Samogitia in exchange for military support against Jagiello. This repeated negotiation with the order, documented in several treaties, demonstrated a tactical ruthlessness and willingness to sacrifice national territory solely to secure his individual birthright and political supremacy over his cousin. This persistent internal warfare, financed and supplied by the Grand Duchy's greatest threat, finally proved too costly for the newly crowned King Jagiello of Poland. Recognizing that continued domestic strife risked the complete collapse of the Grand Duchy into the hands of the Teutonic Knights, Jagiello moved to finalize a definitive political solution, abandoning his efforts to control the duchy through intermediaries and establishing the groundwork for the future Ostrog agreement. The definitive resolution of the Lithuanian succession crisis was formalized in the Ostrog agreement of 1392, terminating the debilitating civil war between Vytautas and Jagiello. This treaty was a triumph of strategic necessity over personal animosity, driven by the realization that continued internal conflict risked the permanent loss of the Grand Duchy to the Teutonic Order. Under the terms, Vytautas was granted the title of Grand Duke of Lithuania, Magnus Dux Lithuaniae, while Jagiello, now King of Poland, nominally retained the title of Supreme Duke, signifying the continuation of the dynastic union. Crucially, the practical authority transferred entirely to Vytautas, establishing the Grand Duchy as a de facto independent state under his direct rule, effectively ending Jagiello's attempt to govern Lithuania through viceroys. Vytautas's consolidation of power was methodical, immediately moving to centralize political authority across the sprawling state. He systematically replaced disloyal or autonomous Ruthenian princes and Lithuanian kunigai with loyal vassals or direct appointees, transforming the vast eastern territories from a confederation of semi-independent principalities into a unified realm. This centralization was predicated on creating a robust administrative apparatus loyal to Vilnius, securing the Grand Duke's financial and military resources without Polish interference. He further weakened the power of the Ruthenian Orthodox nobility by promoting Lithuanian Catholics, particularly within the crucial administrative and military structures, cementing the political dominance of the ethnic Lithuanian core. His foreign policy during this 40-year reign focused on an unprecedented military expansion into the east and south. Vytautas asserted dominion over territories stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, incorporating major cities such as Smolensk in 1395, a critical commercial and military node that secured the Grand Duchy's eastern flank. His authority extended over the territories of the crumbling Golden Horde, positioning him as a major player in the complicated geopolitical landscape of the Pontic steppes. This immense territorial control established the Grand Duchy of Lithuania as the largest state in geographic Europe during this era. The Union of Vilnius and Radom in 1401 further defined the nature of the relationship with Poland. This formal act acknowledged Vytautas's lifetime authority over the Grand Duchy as a distinct and autonomous territory, confirming that only after his death would the title revert to Jagiello or his appointed successor. This provided Vytautas with the legal recognition needed to pursue his expansionist agenda without continuous political entanglement from Krakow, confirming the practical independence he had secured at Ostra and allowing him to focus the Grand Duchy's immense, consolidated resources on external threats and territorial acquisition. The definitive consolidation of Vytautas's power under the Ostra Agreement allowed him to redirect the Grand Duchy's immense, centralized resources toward an unprecedented military and diplomatic expansion into the east. This strategy focused primarily on asserting control over the weakening Golden Horde territories and pushing back against the burgeoning power of Muscovy, the chief long-term rival for dominance over the fractured East Slavic lands. Vytautas's expansionist policy was driven by the geopolitical vacuum left by the declining Mongol-Tatar authority in the Pontic steppes. The first objective was the systematic absorption of key Russian principalities that had once paid tribute to the Golden Horde, but now sought Lithuanian protection from both Mongol incursions and Muscovite pressure. Following the incorporation of Smolensk in 1395, a critical military and trade node, Vytautas extended his influence over territories up to the Oka and Volga river basins. He skillfully utilized the internal strife of the Golden Horde, offering refuge to deposed Khans, most notably Toktamish, who sought Lithuanian military support to regain the throne. This alliance led to Vytautas's ambitious Great Eastern Campaign, culminating in the Battle of the Vorskla River in 1399. Commanding a massive coalition army that included Lithuanian, Polish, and Teutonic auxiliary forces, Vytautas aimed to decisively crush the Golden Horde under Khan Timur Kutlu and establish a vast, permanent zone of Lithuanian influence stretching to the Black Sea. Although the initial stages of the campaign were successful, the battle itself resulted in a catastrophic defeat for the coalition. The Tatar cavalry, utilizing their traditional maneuverability and feigned retreats, destroyed the combined Polish-Lithuanian infantry, resulting in the death of 22 Russian princes and a staggering loss of military capacity for the Grand Duchy. Despite this military setback, the geopolitical outcomes remained favorable to Lithuania. While the defeat temporarily halted offensive expansion into the deep steppes, it did not relinquish the territories already acquired. The Grand Duchy successfully retained its dominion over the crucial principalities of Kyiv, Chernihiv, and Podolia, maintaining the state's status as the largest political entity in Europe. The decisive factor was that the Mongol-Tatar forces, though victorious, lacked the centralized strength or administrative depth to occupy or administer the reclaimed lands. Furthermore, Vytautas exerted constant military pressure on the western principalities traditionally controlled by Muscovy, establishing his authority over Tver and forcing favorable treaties upon the Muscovite Grand Prince Vasily I, his own son-in-law. This diplomatic manipulation and military posturing ensured that the eastern borders of the Grand Duchy remained stable for decades, preventing the aggressive consolidation of Muscovite power and securing the immense eastern flank of the Lithuanian state. Vytautas's policy cemented the Grand Duchy's identity not merely as a defender of the Baltic littoral, but as the primary inheritor and consolidator of the fragmented political landscape of Kyivan Rus. The Battle of the Vorskla River in 1399 stands as the definitive military catastrophe that abruptly truncated Vytautas's eastern ambitions forcing a radical shift in the Grand Duchy's strategic priorities. The conflict was the climax of Vytautas's Great Eastern Campaign, which sought to permanently dismantle the remnants of the Golden Horde and secure the vast territories of the Pontic steppes for the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, GDL. Vytautas was actively supporting the deposed Khan Toktamish to restore him to power as a loyal vassal, thereby extending GDL influence to the Volga River. The scale of the military effort was unprecedented, reflecting the immense confidence and consolidated resources of the GDL under Vytautas. The Lithuanian army was augmented by powerful coalition forces, including contingents from the Kingdom of Poland, the Teutonic Order, sent as auxiliaries following an earlier treaty, and numerous Ruthenian princes. This coalition force, numbering approximately 38,000 troops, primarily consisted of heavy cavalry and infantry, demonstrating a reliance on established European military doctrine. Vytautas was tactically prepared, creating a defensive wagon fort on the Vorskla riverbanks, anticipating a typical frontal Tatar attack. However, the opposing Mongol Tatar forces, led by Khan Timur Kutlug and his powerful general Edigu, utilized superior strategic planning. They employed the classic feigned retreat maneuver with devastating effectiveness. The coalition heavy cavalry, eager for a decisive engagement, broke formation and pursued the seemingly retreating Tatar light cavalry deep into the steppes, away from their protective infantry and wagon defense. The Tatars then quickly encircled and annihilated the disordered pursuit force. The resulting military defeat was catastrophic, not merely a tactical loss, but a staggering blow to the GDL's military and aristocratic core. The battle resulted in the death of 22 Russian princes and commanders, along with a massive portion of the elite Lithuanian nobility and the auxiliary Polish forces. This loss of experienced leadership and military capacity instantly crippled the Grand Duchy's ability to project force deep into the east. The geopolitical consequences were immediate. The aggressive push toward the Black Sea and the Volga ceased, and the GDL was forced into a defensive posture, confirming the continuation of the Mongol Tatar presence in the steppes under Edigu. The disaster at Vorskla served as a crucial strategic pivot for Vytautas. With his eastern policy permanently checked, his attention was definitively redirected westward. The need to recover from the military and political humiliation, and to secure Lithuania's authority, necessitated a final, conclusive resolution to the century-long conflict with the Teutonic Order. Vorskla effectively terminated Vytautas's imperial dreams in the east, focusing his remaining political and military energy on the existential fight that would culminate 11 years later at Grunwald. The definitive shift toward an unavoidable military confrontation between the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the Teutonic Order was entirely predicated on the question of permanent sovereignty over Samogitia. This relatively small, impoverished western territory represented the critical geographical link that divided the Teutonic Order's main Prussian state from its Livonian branch. For the Order, control of this region was an existential military and logistical imperative. For Lithuania, the retention of the indigenous, fiercely loyal population was a matter of internal cohesion and strategic buffer defense. Despite the formal Christianization of the Lithuanian heartland, Samogitia remained militarily and culturally defiant, and its status continued to be manipulated by both sides for diplomatic gain. The Grand Duchy, under Vytautas, found itself repeatedly forced to concede Samogitia to the Order in treaties, viewing the territory as a temporary sacrifice necessary to gain military non-intervention or support for its ambitious eastern policies. However, the subsequent administration by the Teutonic Knights was consistently characterized by severe repression, exploitation, and the imposition of foreign rule that alienated the local aristocracy and population. This cycle of diplomatic cession and practical misrule culminated in the Samogitian uprising of 1409. The local population, maintaining their ancestral political structures and pagan identity, openly revolted against the brutal governance of the Order's appointed Vogds. This rebellion was immediately and strategically supported by Vytautas, marking his final and absolute repudiation of all previous treaties regarding the territory. By providing the Samogitian rebels with supplies, military organization, and tacit recognition, the Grand Duke effectively reclaimed sovereignty and destroyed the legal premise of the Order's continued aggression. The Teutonic Order, led by Grand Master Ulrich von Jungingen, interpreted Vytautas's support for the rebellion not merely as a breach of treaty, but as a direct declaration of war. For decades, the Order's military and political infrastructure had been geared toward unifying its territories by eliminating the Lithuanian wedge. The Samogitian issue was the last remaining legal pretext for the ongoing Heilige Krieg, the Holy War, which provided the Order with continuous financial and military support from Western Europe. With Lithuania now a formally Catholic nation, the justification for crusading had largely vanished, making the status of the unbaptized Samogitians an invaluable political commodity. The escalation was immediate and definitive. The Grand Master issued an ultimatum to the Polish-Lithuanian Union, demanding the immediate cessation of all support for the Samogitian rebels and the complete handover of the disputed land. Jagiello and Vytautas, unified by the threat, formally rejected this demand. With the Order's political and theological justification threatened, and the Grand Duchy's strategic interests demanding a permanent Western solution, the diplomatic avenues closed completely. The political crisis over Samogitia therefore became the direct trigger, forcing both the Grand Duchy and the Kingdom of Poland to mobilize their combined military forces for the inevitable, large-scale confrontation that would decide the fate of Eastern Europe. The declaration of war in 1409, precipitated by the Samogitian uprising, launched the Polish-Lithuanian Union into a necessary year-long phase of meticulous, covert preparation for the decisive military campaign of 1410. The strategic objective, agreed upon between King Jagiello of Poland and Grand Duke Vytautas of Lithuania, was to unite their armies deep within the forested regions of Masovia, conceal their true numbers, and strike directly into the Teutonic Order's heartland in Prussia. This required an unprecedented feat of logistical coordination across the Union's vast fragmented territories. The mobilization was executed under a veil of secrecy designed to deceive the Order's extensive spy network. Crucially, the plan involved convincing the Teutonic leadership that the principal offensive would come from the south, drawing the Order's main strength toward the Polish frontier. Meanwhile, the true, larger offensive was being prepared in the east. Vytautas marshaled the forces of the Grand Duchy, drawing men not only from the Lithuanian Corps, the Augstatian heavy cavalry, and the Samogitian light cavalry, but also from the extensive Ruthenian principalities, Kiev, Smolensk, Podolia, and Tatar contingents. This multi-ethnic force relied on speed and endurance, preparing for a long march through difficult terrain. The logistical challenge of supplying this combined army was immense. In the Grand Duchy, supply trains were organized primarily to support the movement across the eastern and northern forests. Resources were collected and stockpiled in forward depots, utilizing the Grand Duchy's river systems for initial transport before shifting to wagons and pack horses. The strategy for the march itself was predicated on maximum concealment, avoiding major roads and marching through dense wilderness to prevent accurate enemy reconnaissance of their numbers and intended direction. The Polish mobilization, while more conventional, focused on organizing the armored Polish Krzyżowa, cross, cavalry and infantry. Jagiello oversaw the establishment of crucial supply points along the Vistula River. The key tactical element was the construction of a massive temporary pontoon bridge over the Vistula near Cherynsk. This engineering effort was kept strictly secret until the moment of the army's transit in late June 1410. The bridge, built in sections and rapidly assembled, allowed the entire Polish force to cross the major natural barrier and rendezvous with Vytautas's Lithuanian forces on schedule. The successful rendezvous between the Polish and Lithuanian armies occurred on the 30th of June 1410, near the agreed-upon location on the Masovian border. This convergence of forces, comprising over 4,000 professional soldiers and retinues, demonstrated the efficacy of the political union and the tactical brilliance of the joint command. By uniting their armies in a neutral, concealed position far from the frontier, Jagiello and Vytautas successfully circumvented the Order's forward defences, achieving full strategic surprise and positioning themselves for a direct invasion of the Teutonic states' unfortified heartland. The confrontation that determined the political and religious future of Eastern Europe occurred on the 15th of July 1410, on the plains between the villages of Grunwald, Tannenberg, and Lodwigowo. The Polish-Lithuanian coalition, fielding approximately 40,000 combatants, was composed of two distinct wings. The Polish armoured Chorągwi banners anchored the left under King Jagiello, while the Lithuanian, Ruthenian, and Tatar light and medium cavalry formed the right under the tactical command of Grand Duke Vytautas. The Teutonic Order, led by Grand Master Ulrich von Jungingen, occupied the slightly elevated defensive ground, presenting disciplined ranks of heavily armoured knights and supporting artillery. The engagement commenced under a summer sun after a strategic delay. The Grand Master initiated the action by dispatching two bare swords to Jagiello, a calculated psychological move meant to taunt the Polish monarch into committing his forces prematurely. Jagiello accepted the symbolic challenge, and the battle was joined. Vytautas's Lithuanian wing initiated the primary offensive, launching a massive cavalry charge against the Order's left flank. This was not intended as the decisive blow, but served as the execution of a critical strategic design refined by the joint command. After a sustained, intense, but inconclusive struggle against the disciplined, deeply echeloned Teutonic ranks, the Lithuanian and Tatar contingents executed a pre-planned feigned retreat. This maneuver was intended to dissolve the Order's tactical discipline and draw its elite heavy cavalry reserves out of their protected, organized positions. Perceiving a route and confident in their superior armor, the Teutonic commanders, against standard military doctrine, committed a significant portion of their cavalry reserves to a deep, disordered pursuit across the field. This decision critically fractured the Order's defensive line and exposed its flanks. While the pursuit continued, the Polish left flank engaged the main Teutonic centre in a brutal, protracted clash of armoured heavy cavalry. The battle reached its climax when the pursuing Teutonic forces were far from the main body. The Lithuanian wing suddenly halted, wheeled its cavalry, and returned to the attack. Simultaneously, Jagiello released his final, freshest Polish reserves into the centre. This massive pressure, compounded by the return of Vytautas's forces, effectively created a three-pronged envelopment of the remaining Teutonic formations. The Grand Master, recognizing the tactical disaster, personally led the Order's last 16 banners of elite brothers in a desperate countercharge to break the Union's centre, but this effort failed completely. The conclusion of the battle was a definitive, systemic destruction of the Order's military capacity. The Grand Master, the Grand Marshal, and 14 other major commanders, along with hundreds of Teutonic Bruder, perished on the field. The Order suffered over 1,800 casualties, and the loss of its entire military aristocracy in a single afternoon. This defeat permanently crippled the Teutonic state, securing the Samogitian land question and permanently neutralizing the Order as a major geopolitical force in Eastern Europe. The victory established the Polish-Lithuanian Union as the dominant regional power. The immediate political and military task following the decisive victory at Grunwald in 1410 was the strategic neutralization of the shattered Teutonic state, a process defined by the Treaty of Torun. Although the combined Union forces had achieved a catastrophic battlefield victory, the subsequent pursuit and siege operations proved inconclusive. The Polish and Lithuanian armies failed to capture the Order's capital, Malbork Castle, due to logistical exhaustion, internal strategic disagreements, and the sheer defensive capability of the immense fortress. This operational failure meant the final dismantling of the Order had to be achieved through diplomacy rather than total military subjugation. Negotiations between the Union and the surviving Order leadership commenced swiftly, culminating in the First Peace of Torun in February 1411. This treaty formally codified the total geopolitical shift that Grunwald had initiated. The terms imposed by Jagiello and Vytautas were designed to permanently cripple the order's military and financial capacity, while specifically addressing the long-standing casus belli concerning Samogitia. The primary territorial consequence for the Grand Duchy of Lithuania was the definitive return of Samogitia. The treaty stipulated that the order must cede all claims and fortifications in Samogitia to the Grand Duke for the lifetime of Vytautas and Jagiello, with the issue of ultimate sovereignty remaining technically unresolved, though practically settled. This clause effectively achieved Vytautas's key strategic objective, securing the crucial Baltic frontier and removing the order's legal pretext for continuous invasion of the Lithuanian heartland. For the Kingdom of Poland, the treaty mandated the return of the Dobrine land and an enormous indemnity payment. The order was required to pay a sum of 1,000,000 kopecks of Prague groschen, payable in 4 annual installments. This astronomical levy, imposed to reimburse the Union for the expenses of the war, was the most devastating term. To meet this financial obligation, the order was forced to liquidate significant assets, impose ruinous taxes on its burghers, and borrow heavily from Western European financiers. This debt load fundamentally compromised the order's economic autonomy. Furthermore, the treaty confirmed the cessation of the order's political aggression by mandating the release of all prisoners and guaranteeing the religious freedom of all inhabitants in the ceded territories. The order's loss of its military aristocracy, coupled with the crippling indemnity and the permanent loss of its primary ideological war objective, meant that the Teutonic state was permanently downgraded from an existential threat to a diminished regional power. The Treaty of Torun thus represented the diplomatic culmination of the military victory. It was not merely a peace settlement, but a foundational document that formally ended the 200-year conflict, securing the territorial integrity of the Grand Duchy and permanently establishing the Polish-Lithuanian Union as the preeminent political force in Eastern Europe. The final 2 decades of Vytautas's existence constituted the Grand Duchy of Lithuania's period of absolute political autonomy, where his authority was undisputed both within the vast Eastern realm and across the diplomatic landscape of Europe. Following the definitive settlement with Jagiello, Vytautas became the de facto sovereign, directing the state's military, fiscal, and foreign policies entirely independently. His administration focused on dismantling the inherited system of appanage principalities in the Ruthenian lands, replacing local, autonomous princes with centrally appointed governors, known as starosts, who were loyal exclusively to Vilnius. This systemic political centralization transformed the Grand Duchy from a fragile federation into a unified state governed by a Lithuanian Catholic elite. The sheer territorial scale and military power of the GDL secured Vytautas a diplomatic standing unmatched in the East. His court regularly hosted envoys from the Byzantine Empire, the Hanseatic League, and the Tatar Khans, leveraging the GDL's status as a formidable intermediary. This prestige was strategically utilized through a complex network of matrimonial alliances, weaving Vytautas's descendants into the royal houses of Muscovy and Tver, extending Lithuanian dynastic influence deep into Eastern Europe, and consolidating control over strategically vital borders. The culmination of this diplomatic success was his pursuit of a formal royal crown, a final move intended to secure the GDL's perpetual juridical independence from the Polish crown. This aspiration was primarily driven by the need for dynastic parity and to prevent the Lithuanian aristocracy from becoming subordinate to Poland after his passing. The issue reached a climax at the Congress of Lutsk in 1429. This monumental gathering, organized by Vytautas, saw the attendance of Emperor Sigismund, Jagiello, and delegates from the papacy. During this summit, the Holy Roman Emperor publicly affirmed the sovereignty of the Grand Duchy and formally agreed to crown Vytautas as King of Lithuania. However, this plan met with fierce and immediate opposition from the Polish political elite, who viewed the creation of an independent Lithuanian kingdom as a direct threat to the Polish-Lithuanian Union and their own future dominance. Despite imperial and papal consent, Polish magnates successfully mobilized to intercept the crown and royal insignia en route to Vilnius. The lack of a formal coronation, caused entirely by Polish obstruction, meant that while Vytautas was acknowledged as a king by Europe's supreme secular authority, he died in 1430 without ever achieving the royal title, leaving the exact legal status of the Grand Duchy unresolved upon his death. The death of Vytautas the Great in October 1430 precipitated an immediate and severe political crisis that threatened to unravel decades of centralized authority. The Grand Duke expired before achieving his formal royal coronation, leaving the Grand Duchy's legal status ambiguous. It remained de jure subordinate to the Polish crown under the Union of Kryło, yet its ruling elite were committed to maintaining the de facto independence secured by Vytautas. This ambiguity instantly polarized the ruling class, splintering them into powerful competing factions. The main divide emerged between the advocates of continued autonomy, the Lithuanian magnates, and those who favored deepening the constitutional relationship with Poland, the Ruthenian princes, and elements of the Catholic clergy. The Lithuanian magnates, seeking to preserve the Grand Duchy's distinct statehood, unilaterally elected Vytautas's cousin Świetrzygaila as the new Grand Duke. Świetrzygila's character, marked by volatility and aggressive ambition, was ill-suited for the delicate diplomatic maneuvering required. His immediate policy was one of outright defiance of the Union, challenging Polish interests and attempting to re-establish the GDL as a fully sovereign power. He quickly alienated Jagiello and the Polish court, confirming their worst fears regarding Lithuanian autonomy and provoking direct military conflict. This internal schism soon developed into a destructive civil war that lasted over 7 years. The conflict was not merely a dynastic struggle, but a struggle for the very structure of the state. It pitted Świetrzygila's faction, which drew support from the Ruthenian Orthodox nobility, who often chafed under Polish Catholic influence, against the Polish-backed faction led by Žygimantas Kęstutis, Vytautas's last surviving brother. The military engagements of this civil war, particularly the Battle of Pabaiskas, Wielkomierz, in 1435, devastated the core political and military resources of the Grand Duchy, resulting in heavy casualties among the most powerful noble houses and crippling the administrative capacity established by Vytautas. Simultaneously, the death of the strong Grand Duke triggered the rapid re-emergence of Muscovy as the primary existential threat on the eastern frontier. During Vytautas's lifetime, Muscovy had been contained, often serving as a subordinate ally in Vytautas's schemes to manage the Mongol Tatar Khans. However, the internal weakness following 1430 offered Muscovy a clear opportunity to advance its doctrine of gathering the Russian lands. Muscovite princes, having consolidated their power and territory, now began to actively absorb former border principalities that had been under GDL influence. The focus of the Grand Duchy's foreign policy immediately and irrevocably shifted from the defeated Teutonic Order in the west to the burgeoning, aggressive power consolidating around Moscow in the east. This shift permanently redefined the GDL's geopolitical existence, setting the stage for 2 centuries of resource draining, defensive warfare against an expansive unitary eastern rival. The period spanning the late 15th and early 16th centuries was defined by a series of devastating, high-intensity conflicts with the emerging, expansive Grand Principality of Muscovy. Having capitalized on the instability following Vytautas's death, Muscovy aggressively pursued its stated doctrine of gathering the Russian lands, systematically laying claim to and invading the eastern principalities of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. These wars, not single campaigns but chronic, drawn-out military confrontations, fundamentally altered the GDL's territorial integrity and political independence. The conflicts began in earnest under Muscovy's Ivan III, the Great, who adopted the title of Tsar and declared himself the protector of all Orthodox subjects, including the vast Ruthenian nobility within the GDL. The initial phase of this long struggle, starting in 1492, resulted in swift and catastrophic territorial loss for the Grand Duchy. Muscovy leveraged the religious and linguistic affinity it shared with the GDL's Orthodox border princes, persuading several key noble families to defect and transfer their allegiances, along with their lands, to Moscow. This process, known as the secession of the border princes, eroded the GDL's eastern buffer territories and its vast network of frontier fortifications, handing Muscovy access to major strategic strongholds. The most severe territorial defeats occurred in the Second Muscovite War, 1500–1503, which followed a calculated Muscovite invasion during a period of GDL preoccupation with Crimean Tatar incursions. The catastrophic Battle of Vedrosha in 1500 saw the total defeat and capture of the Grand Hetman Konstanty Ostrogsky and thousands of key military personnel. This single engagement dismantled the GDL's primary field army and revealed the superior size and unitary command structure of Muscovite forces. The subsequent Treaty of 1503 forced the Grand Duchy to surrender approximately one-third of its entire territory, including the strategically vital cities of Chernihiv, Novgorod-Siversky, and parts of Smolensk province, permanently shifting the eastern border westward. This relentless grinding warfare had a profound fiscal and political impact. The financial burden of maintaining a standing army large enough to defend a 1,000-mile frontier drained the GDL's treasury, which was already strained by the necessity of annual payments to the Crimean Khanate to prevent further Tatar incursions into the south. The overwhelming military pressure and the recognition that the GDL could no longer effectively defend its vast domains independently compelled the Lithuanian nobility to seek closer political reliance upon the Polish crown. This was expressed through renewed constitutional agreements, such as the Union of Melnik in 1501, which attempted to formalize a defensive military alliance and institutionalize a common government structure, though it was quickly repudiated. The existential threat posed by Muscovy thus became the central catalyst, forcing the Lithuanian elite to accept the inevitable political subordination that would culminate in the final legal union of the two states later in the Priyan century. The period of intense Muscovite military pressure, which eroded the Grand Duchy's eastern borders, paradoxically gave rise to its most definitive cultural and political achievement, the comprehensive codification of its laws into the statutes of Lithuania. This monumental legal endeavor occurred across the 16th century, defining the state's unique character just as its political autonomy was becoming most threatened by external forces and internal Polish influence. The drafting was necessitated by the complex legal duality resulting from centuries of territorial expansion, where tribal customary law, Ruthenian legal traditions, and Polish administrative concepts coexisted in confusion. The first definitive statute was enacted in 1529 under Grand Duke Sigismund I the Old, spearheaded primarily by Chancellor Albertus Gostautus. This initial compilation served as an official restatement of all common law and royal decrees, creating a singular, accessible legal text. Critically, this first statute explicitly declared the primacy of the Grand Duchy's law over any foreign influence, including Polish legislation, thereby serving as a robust juridical foundation for the GDL's distinct sovereignty, even as it relied on the Polish crown for military defense. The legal and cultural importance of the statutes only intensified with the subsequent editions. The second statute, 1566, released just before the climactic Union of Lublin, was necessitated by administrative reforms and the elevation of the Szlachta nobility to political parity with the magnates. It established the principle of noble participation in government and codified new constitutional relationships, defining judicial procedures with precision. This edition was notable for its clarity and its establishment of the Ruthenian language, Old Belarusian, as the exclusive language of the state's chancellery, administration, and law, permanently embedding a multi-ethnic identity at the core of the state's jurisprudence. The culmination arrived with the third statute, 1588, implemented after the Union of Lublin. This final iteration was a comprehensive legal encyclopedia, recognized throughout Europe for its sophistication and detail, covering everything from criminal and civil law to constitutional relationships and land tenure. Most significantly, the third statute contained articles that directly contradicted the terms of the Union of Lublin, forbidding foreigners, specifically Polish subjects, from acquiring land or holding high office within the Grand Duchy. This deliberate legal defiance was the final collective attempt by the Lithuanian Szlachta to preserve the GDL's statehood and distinctiveness against Polish constitutional absorption. The statutes thus became the symbolic guarantor of the Grand Duchy's cultural legacy, maintaining a singular legal and linguistic identity long after its political destiny was merged with Poland. The final definitive stage in the constitutional relationship between the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the Kingdom of Poland culminated in the Union of Lublin in 1569, a political act driven by overwhelming military and demographic pressures. The series of devastating Muscovite wars, particularly the Livonian War, 1558–1583, exposed the structural weakness of the GDL's military and fiscal systems. Despite ruling the largest state in Europe, the Lithuanian treasury and noble military levy, Pospolite Russiny, proved chronically insufficient to defend the 1,000-mile eastern frontier against the unified, expansive armies of Muscovy. The loss of vital territories, including Polotsk, demonstrated the existential threat facing the Grand Duchy, forcing its nobility to accept that defense was impossible without a complete military and political integration with Poland. The union was initiated by Sigismund II Augustus, the last Jagiellonian king, who faced the immediate problem of dynastic succession and the need to secure the permanence of the Polish-Lithuanian alliance. The negotiations began formally in Lublin in 1569, quickly becoming a period of profound constitutional crisis. The Polish faction, desiring complete political absorption, pushed for a unitary state where the GDL would surrender its distinct institutions. The Lithuanian magnates, led by figures like Jan Chodkiewicz, staunchly defended the Grand Duchy's sovereignty, demanding a continued federal structure with separate armies, chanceries, and laws. When the Lithuanian delegation refused to compromise on the preservation of their state institutions and attempted a dramatic withdrawal from the Diet, King Sigismund II Augustus employed the full weight of his regal authority to force the issue. Utilizing his power as Grand Duke of Lithuania, he issued a series of unilateral incorporation decrees. These decrees summarily detached the most economically and strategically valuable Ruthenian provinces, Volhynia, Podolia, Kiev, and Podlakia, from the Grand Duchy, and incorporated them directly into the Polish crown. This seizure of vast territories, constituting roughly 1/3 of the GDL's remaining land and population, was a devastating act that crippled the Grand Duchy's economic power and demographic base. Stripped of its southern provinces and facing continued Muscovite incursions in the north, the remaining Lithuanian nobility were compelled to return to Lublin and sign the Act of Union. The resultant Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was established as a real union, meaning the two states were perpetually joined under a single jointly elected monarch and possessed a single parliament, the Sejm. While the Commonwealth retained distinct administrative offices, laws, treasuries, and armies for the Grand Duchy, the Union decisively concluded the GDL's history as an independent geopolitical entity. The era of the autonomous medieval Grand Duchy was definitively closed, replaced by a dual-state structure where the Lithuanian component existed in mandatory and perpetual partnership with the Crown of Poland.